Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Howland. I'm a PhD student at the University of California, San Diego in the Anthropology department, working with Professor Tom Levy. And my dissertation will be focused on the Iron Age ceramics and, in general, archaeological evidence from Khirbat al-Jariya, Jordan. That's going to be the focus of my talk today. And so, when we focus in on the Iron Age in Faynan, Jordan, the Iron Age really saw the peak of industrial scale metallurgical production in the region, which in general occurred across a lot of the history of the Faynan region. But as I mentioned, the peak is really happening in the early Iron Age, with an estimated 100 to 130,000 tons of slag produced in the region. And this production really centered at Khirbat al-Nahas, which has been investigated over a number of years by the Edom Lowlands Regional Archaeology Project, which is directed by Tom Levy and Mohammad Najjar. And so the peak of this production was in the early 10th to 9th centuries BCE. But today we're not going to be focusing on Ken in particular, but rather the nearby site of Khirbat al-Jariya, which, as you can see here, is located about 3 kilometers up the Wadi al-Jariya from Khirbat al-Nahas, which still remain the center of copper production. But recent excavations and evidence coming from our 2014 work at Khirbat al-Jariya has really shown the role that Khirbat al-Jariya played in the overall Iron Age industrial landscape. And we're starting to learn more about this site, and the ceramic evidence that I'm going to discuss today really kind of plays an important role in that. So in 2014, we focused on 2 main areas of excavation. These 2 areas are areas B in the north center of the site and area C in the southeast of the site, in addition to area A, which has already been excavated under LRAP and published by Erez Ben Yosef. Area C is a slag mound, which we did a 1 by 1 meter probe intended to kind of, match the phases of production with the 2006 excavations. And area B, which is the largest structure at the site, centrally located and really excavated in order to study the social control of copper production and the role of elites at the site. And I think you'll see that the ceramics really do have something to say about that. So the stratigraphy of area B is a little bit complex due to the reliance of the stratigraphy on some architectural restructuring at the site, some door blocking that happened after the initial occupation and construction of the site. But as you can see, there's 3 main strata that occur at the site: B2C, B2B, and B2A. And this just gives you a general framework. But what's important to understand these strata is that all of them are occurring in the mid-11th to the mid-10th century BCE. So as you can see, based on the radiocarbon diagram here from the 2014 excavations at Khirbat al-Jariya, we did 10 radiocarbon dates, which are published and discussed in some detail in my colleague Brady Liss's most recent publication in the Journal of Field Archaeology. And those kind of combine with the previous 9 dates that are published in Ben Yosef et al. 2010. But generally speaking, what we see is that nearly all of these dates are suggesting this mid-11th to mid-10th century BCE overall chronology for the site. And what's also important is that trends at the site in combination with these radiocarbon dates illustrate that settlement at CAD should really be seen as an organized expansion of production from Khirbat al-Nahas, rather than the sort of opportunistic early production that we previously thought. So now let's turn to the ceramic evidence and the preliminary analysis of these ceramics. And what's important to note about these ceramics is, these are really some of the first ceramics that are excavated from clear floor context at the site. So it's really providing the best ceramic data that we've seen thus far, despite a small sample size. So at CADS in 2014, we've only recovered 60 diagnostic rim sherds. So, it's a small number. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of classification, develop a new typology or anything like that, but rather to use these sherds. And the small number is typical of an industrial site, but use these sherds to kind of compare with already established typologies, both in Cisjordan and Transjordan. And so in terms of the composition of the assemblage, it's coming in at about 12% handmade ware. And this is very typical of Iron Age copper production sites in Faynan. So Khirbat al-Nahas, for example, is right around the same number. Now, of course, 12% is quite high compared to sedentary sites such as those in traditional Highland Edom, and also sites in Cisjordan as well, sedentary sites there. But 12% is actually on the low end of, I would say, copper production and trade affiliated sites, such as those in Timna, also in the Wadi Arabah, the copper production sites, and sites in the Negev highlands, such as the sort of notorious Negev fortresses, the so-called Negev fortresses. Between Timna and the Negev fortresses, those sites are coming in at maybe more like 50% handmade ware. So we're kind of right in the middle there, but this is a typical percentage of handmade ware for a copper production site in Faynan. If we go into detail about the preliminary form classification and how the ceramics group out by their form, generally speaking, it's pretty standard for, again, an Iron Age copper production site in Faynan, comparing most closely to nearby Khirbat al-Nahas. A couple things I want to point out that are worthy of some additional discussion. First of all, the rate of bowls is quite low. 9.7 is very low compared to any of the sites, in particular studied by Smith and Levy and in their kind of comprehensive study of Edomite ceramics. But in general, when you consider bowls and craters together, which might be appropriate given that both of these presumably would have been used in domestic concepts for food, some food preparation and food consumption in particular, the overall number is quite balanced there. But one thing to note is the excavations of Khirbat al-Jariya in 2006 actually kind of uncovered a low number of bowls as well. So that's something to consider down the line. The second thing I want to point out is the rate of cooking pots, which for all copper production sites in the early Iron Age, including those in Faynan and in Timna, all the sites in the Wadi Arabah, feature quite low percentage of the sort of typical wheel-made cooking pots. And so at Khirbat al-Jariya, we only have one example of a clear cooking pot. So that's definitely interesting to note. One kind of perhaps mitigating factor is that Meschel, Bernard Greenberg, and others have discussed the potential use of this kind of handmade Arabah ware as cooking pot material at some of these copper production and trade affiliated sites. And that may be the case here as well, where we have handmade whole mouth jars that may have been serving that role at Khirbat al-Jariya. So that's something to keep in mind there. In terms of the wheel-made ware, if we turn towards qualitative analysis, and again, I think it's important to think about the parallels here, considering that we're dealing with these contexts that are clearly based on the floors at the site excavated in Building 2 in Area B. So I'm going to present to you all of the plates that come from these diagnostic rim shirts at the site, and then kind of dial into a couple that warrant a little bit more discussion. So here are the craters, and if you have any questions about any of this material, I'll be happy to discuss with you in the the ASOR Q&A session, or also you can feel free to email me, and I'll put my information at the end of the lecture today. But if we dial in on crater 1, which is one of the most common forms at Khirbat al-Jariya, it's a crater with a thickened and rounded rim here. You can see that some parallels exist from early Iron Age sites, such as Kadesh Barnea Stratum 4, Lachish Stratum 5-4, and Tel Batash Strata 5 and 4 as well. And also a parallel from late Iron Age Tawilan, which potentially is limited evidence of a cultural affinity there, but it's only one parallel. Crater 2 is another example worth discussing, which is one of the interesting types as well. And two of these three are found in the Area C slag mounds. That's something interesting to consider as well. And these are typically white slipped at Khirbat al-Jariya, whereas some of the parallels have been treated in red, such as red slip. So these these craters, they do bear some similarity to some examples of bowl 8 from Casilla, which is typically a Sima type bowl, although many of the examples are not clearly similar to Cadge at all. But there's also some examples from different times and periods. So this is still something to consider and make sure we're finding the closest parallels. The bowls at the site are very interesting despite their limited number. And that's another point that's worth diving into a little bit. So in particular, 2 of the bowls are red slipped and burnished. The first bowl that you can see up there, which is called bowl 1 in my preliminary classification, is just a simple bowl with a hand burnish, whereas the second bowl is a little bit more sophisticated. Both of these are fine ware. They appear to have the same fabric, although I'll be studying that with petrography as some of my future work. And so what's important to note about a red slip and hand burnish is that it's very characteristic of the iron 2A, although when we're considering red slip and hand burnish, typically what should be done is to consider the overall rates of this burnish compared to other surface treatment types at the site. Of course, given the very limited quality, we can't really say that this red slip and hand burnish is actually chronologically diagnostic, but certainly it's appearing in the Iron Age, whether that's the very early Iron Age or a little bit later. So another interesting point to make about these red slip and burnished bowls is that similar bowls were studied by Neil Smith, who petrographically studied the examples from Khirbat al-Nahas, and found that these bowls were likely imports from the Negev. So the early hypothesis about the provenance of these bowls, the original provenience, is that likely they were imported from the Negev. And the fact that they're fineware imports is significant, as you'll see later on with regard to their context, which is in the center of room 3, the central room in area B at Khirbat al-Jariya. So I'll also show you the jugs here from the site, but not discuss them any further. The example of a cooking pot, which is a relatively unique version of a cooking pot with some parallels from the earlier excavation at Khirbat al-Jariya and Khirbat al-Nahas, but a relatively closed-mouth cooking pot. And some of the jars as well. And if you're interested in any of these jars, feel free to contact me. But the one that I'm going to dial in on in particular is what I'm calling jar 1 in my preliminary classification. And you can see here that jar 1 is a cup-spouted jar, which is an interesting type that has a lot of interesting parallels that are worth discussing. And we're going to get into that right now. And jar 1 in particular has a grooved rim and an interesting handle layout, as you can see on the bottom right, where there's 2 regular handles that are kind of spaced at 2/3 positions, and also a cup spout that's bracketed by 2 small handles on either side. And hopefully you're able to see that in these illustrations. So when we discuss the parallels for jar 1, this cup-spouted jar, cup-spouted jars in general are quite common in Judah and elsewhere in the Iron 2B, up to ASOR and many other sites. And the Iron 2B type is not fully standardized, but it has certainly a common type. And you can see that common type in the bottom center parallels from Arad stratum 10 and Beshian. So the Iron 2B type typically has a cup spout which connects at either the rim of the vessel or at the neck of the vessel, and also at the shoulder, and it's quite slim. This cup spout, it has a very kind of small connection to the shoulder, whereas the typical Iron 2A form, where these cup spouted jars also appear in Iron 2A, and as you can see from this example from Arad stratum 11 in the bottom left, the typical Iron 2A form has a cup spout which lies flush against the shoulder of the vessel. And so that's generally an interesting trend, but what's important to note is it's not exclusively the case. It's not a hard and fast rule, we can say. So There are several examples from the Iron 2A that do feature a cup spout that doesn't lay flush to the shoulder of the vessel. Probably the most important parallel for us working in Faynan here is a parallel from Ken stratum R2B, which is a stratum from a monumental building constructed at Catch that's been radiocarbon dated to the 10th century BCE, published by Smith and Levy. And we can also see another example of a cup spouted jar, two examples, in fact, that don't lie flush, but they do have a late Iron 2A date from Lachish stratum 4, which is, of course, a late Iron 2A stratum. So, that kind of opens the door to a more kind of nuanced discussion of what's the actual relative chronology of this vessel, how does it tie in? And another important kind of thing to point out is the handle layout. The handle layout from CAD Star 1 is extremely unique. I haven't been able to find any published parallels with this exact layout, with these two regular handles and two small handles bracketing the cup spout. In fact, the only parallels at all that have a handle adjoining the rim that I've been able to find are, in fact, Iron 2A examples from Faynan. So the first example is from Ken stratum R2B, and you can see in the bottom left here that the little area of the sherd that I'm holding that has been outlined in orange here is a broken off handle that's adjoining the cup spout. And another example from the McDonald survey, site 29 in Faynan, which is quite close to Rouge am Hammer Efdan, for those of you that know the area, which has a single handle adjoining the rim. And so though the latter example was found in a survey context, we can see it does have the typical Iron 2A cup spout that is flush against the shoulder of the vessel. So if we take this all into consideration, CAD Star 1 seems to be a unique Iron 2A form. Certainly the handle layout is unparalleled. And, in fact, even the kind of the way that the cup spout is molded to the vessel is a little bit unique relative to the typical Iron 2B type. So overall, the similarity, I think, is more to these Faynan examples, especially including the grooved rim, which you can also see on this survey site 29 example, and as compared to the Iron 2B type, which is relatively more standardized. So what's an interesting point to consider is whether this vessel from Khirbat al-Jariya is an import, or whether it's sort of a local emulation of a kind of sophisticated ceramic type from elsewhere. And hopefully future ceramic work will help to illustrate that issue and answer the question. So if we think about the overall analysis of the wheel-made ware, generally the assemblage is an Iron 2A assemblage, and I haven't discussed all the parallels here, but generally it is an Iron 2A assemblage. Many parallels from the early strata at Khirbat en-Nahas, which makes sense. It's a nearby site and contemporaneously dated. There's also frequent parallels from the early Iron 2A at Kadesh Barnea stratum 4, later in the Iron 2A Lachish stratum 4, and also many of the Negev highland sites, the so-called Negev fortresses. There are also some parallels from the late Iron Age Edomite highland sites, Tawilan and Busera. So we'll have to think about the question of a cultural affiliation, which has been much debated in and discussed in the literature. And finally, the last point I want to discuss is the room 3 floor context, which features many of the highest quality ceramics at the site. So as you can see, room 3 here, if you see in the center left of that structure, it features many of the highest quality ceramics at the site. This is where both of the red slipped and burnished vessels were found, as well as the complete rim of the cup spouted jar. So these are by far, without question, the highest quality ceramics at the site. If we compare to the ceramics from the slag mound, especially in the early phase of the slag mounds, we're looking at more handmade style wares. And so there's a clear link here, even within the cup spout, which carries a link to the area R monumental building at Ken, which also has some of the finest ceramics from that site. And so that's an interesting link there, and it speaks to probably the elite use of this structure. which we had been a little bit unclear about what this structure was for, but there's some fine grinding slabs, some fine ceramics, and that really tells a story. So the last thing I want to point out is that I've created 3D models of all these vessels, and they're available on Sketchfab for you to download and analyze, should that fancy you. And I've also published the archaeological context of these vessels as well on an ArcGIS story map if you're interested. Please avoid publishing on this material since it's the subject of my dissertation. And generally the conclusions are that Kaj was occupied from the mid-11th to mid-10th century BCE. It's an organized expansion, and really the area B at the site represents an important elite context at the site. Thank you, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me or come to the question and answer session later on. Thank you.